towards Israel. And one of the things bringing Egypt and Israel together is their common enemy, Iran. Iran's influence in the region is growing, and it's at the center of conflicts in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Despite these conflicts and its record of human rights abuses, Iran was elected to serve on a UN agency committed to preserving women's rights. We talked with Hillel Neuer, the executive director of UN Watch, about this development and how the United Nations, at least to many, seems like a world upside down. Hillel, Iran was voted to the UN board to oversee women's rights. What was your reaction to this?
It's an outrage. You know, Iran just 6 months ago was condemned by the United Nations General Assembly for pervasive gender inequality, violence against women, and discrimination in law and in practice against women and girls. It's one of the worst countries in the world on women's rights. In fact, the global gender gap of the World Economic Forum rated Iran one of the worst countries in the world, almost really at the bottom. It's an outrage. Electing Iran to the UN Agency for Women's Equality and Empowerment is like making a pyromaniac into the town fire chief.
How can you explain the fact that many nations voted to put Iran on this board?
The logical thing to do would be to choose countries that have a decent record, have a good record on women's equality and empowerment, not one country that's one of the worst countries. Sadly, the United Nations doesn't work the way it's supposed to in many cases. We have a similar situation at the Human Rights Council where tyrannies like China, Russia, Cuba, Saudi Arabia were recently elected members. Again, contrary to the established criteria of those bodies. In 2010, the United States led the way in finding an alternative candidate so that Iran wouldn't win. When Iran tried the same thing back in 2010, they found a small country, Timor-Leste, which on its own couldn't have won, but America campaigned for them and managed to defeat Iran. This time, neither America nor Europe did any effort to find an alternative candidate, and that's why Iran won. And we're concerned that the US and the EU chose inaction because of the nuclear talks, not to upset the so-called nuclear deal that they have with Iran.
Now, you wrote a letter to the UN Secretary General. Any reaction to that letter?
No response yet, and we're disturbed. The Secretary General is someone who should be a moral leader, and even if things happen at the United Nations, he can. In previous situations, other UN officials, the Director General of UNESCO, Irina Bokova, who's not normally someone who takes principled stands on so many things, but when the Syria's Assad regime was elected to their Human Rights Committee a few years ago, she did say that this was inappropriate. And so we think there's precedent for Ban Ki-moon to say that the election of Iran, a country that arrests women if their head covering isn't strict enough, which allows acid attacks against women, where there's spousal abuse that seems to be legitimized by the government. We think it's outrageous, and the Secretary General needs to speak out.
Did you have any reaction from women's groups that about this vote?
It's a good question. They ought to be the first really to speak out. And I think there have been some. Of the leading groups, I haven't heard something, and I think there is a certain misguided political correctness that's in play here, where some women's rights groups are afraid to criticize Islamist practices for fear of being perceived as Islamophobic or racist. And I think it's wrong, because Iranian women are the first to speak out.
Yeah, you talked about the nuclear negotiations with Iran. What impact has that had on Iran's sort of standing there at the United Nations?
Well, I think it seems to be now that they're getting a kind of immunity. Iran has tried for a number of years to be elected to UN bodies. They did try to be elected to the Human Rights Council, and our group, UN Watch, exposed that about a year and a half ago. And America immediately condemned their candidacy, and they withdrew. But now they were able to do now what they weren't able to do 5 years ago, and I think that this Iran deal gives them the impression of being reasonable. The West now feels that it can't do anything to upset their apple cart.
You know, some people look at the UN, they look at a vote like this, and they almost see like this is the world turned upside down. How would you describe what happens there at the United Nations? You've been there for many years.
Yeah, well, I think what you said is a perfect description. It is a world turned upside down. Every time I walk into the UN Human Rights Council, which was founded by incredible idealists like Eleanor Roosevelt, was the founding chair of the UN Commission on Human Rights, the great humanitarian of her age. And to see today having members like China, Russia, Cuba, Pakistan, Venezuela, it's outrageous. So every time I walk in there, I remind myself that I am walking into an Orwellian institution where human rights have been turned upside down, and that it's an alternate reality. And we go in there to try and speak truth to power, and that's why I'm the most hated man in Geneva.
Can you describe what kind of treatment Israel gets in the United Nations?
Israel gets a treatment that no other country gets. At every session of the Human Rights Council, for example, there's a day on Israel, just like there's a day on human rights situations around the world, and then there's one day just for Israel. It's a special agenda item only to criticize so-called Israeli violations. There's no agenda item for genocide that happened in Darfur and Sudan. There's no agenda item for Syria, where 200,000 to 300,000 people have been killed, millions have been displaced, barrel bombs are being dropped on children, nor on North Korea, one of the most horrific places on the planet for human rights. Only Israel, the Jewish state, gets its own agenda item. And if you look at the number of resolutions, Israel is typically condemned in half the resolutions at the Human Rights Council. The expert on Israel looks only at Israeli violations, which are presumed in advance, and won't look at any Palestinian action. So if there's, God forbid, a suicide bombing in Israel, the expert will criticize Israel's response when it goes to try to find and arrest the terrorists, but it won't criticize a suicide bombing because that's a Palestinian action, which is not in his mandate to examine it. So it's really a very distinctive treatment that is designed to create a narrative as Israel as some sort of wicked human rights abuser.
What is it like for you?
It's not pleasant to be in an assembly where you know that many of the people in front of you in the room despise you for critiquing the UN when they do things that are against their own principles, for taking on tyrannies that have seats of power and influence there. It's not pleasant, but we get support around the world, and we know that we're doing the right thing, and we're going to continue speaking out.
Well, thank you for the work you do, and thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.